Okay, so once again, you're all very, very welcome to this, the fourth session of our annual conference titled Public Services After COVID and How We Should Pay for Them. In this afternoon session, we have three brilliant speakers. There's been a slight change to the lineup because unfortunately, Daniela Gabor had a relapse of COVID, and we wish her the very best, and we hope she recovers fully and quickly. On our panel this afternoon, we have, first of all, Sebastian Barnes, Chair of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council. We have the inimitable Colin McCarthy, and we also have Michael Taft, an economist and researcher at SIPTU. This session comes from, I guess, what we've seen in the last 18 months to 2 years has been vastly increased government intervention and government expenditure. And we've seen a very much an expanded public services. And when we were coming up with the conference program, we said we had a hat tip to Keynes as how to pay for the war. And then we realized, well, the war isn't really over because maybe we will need a more expanded public sector, particularly in the area of health. And so the question arises, how should we pay for this? There are a number of opposing views, of course. There's the view that public spending should be reined in, that we have come through a period of hugely increased government expenditure, and that now is the time to rein it in. And of course, on the other side, we have the MMT view that perhaps we should loosen the purse strings even further. So without further ado, I would like to call on our first speaker, Mr. Sebastian Barnes, Chair of the Irish Fiscal Advisory Council. The screen is yours, Sebastian.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the invitation to the Dublin Economic Workshop. I think the sessions so far have been really great. I think they're dealing with some of the really big issues. And I think we're going to be dealing with some of the really big issues in this session as well. Let me just share my screen. Can everyone see that? Cool. So, I guess I'm going to take a slightly different angle to the public services after COVID and how to pay for them. The council twice a year is doing sort of assessments of the government's programme and the SPU and the budget. What I want to do here is take a bit of a step back, perhaps a bit more of a personal perspective, and I really want to focus on two issues. One is, I think, the feeling or my assessment that the environment for the public services and public finances is going to be much tougher in the years after COVID than we were used to, actually, in a relatively sweet spot we were in from about 2015 to 2019. And the other idea I want to develop is the role of budgeting and the way the public finances are managed in managing what's going to be, in my view, a more complex situation. But let me start first from COVID. The COVID spending has been absolutely huge, and we've seen absolutely record, or more or less record, deficits as a result. And that's obviously been absolutely necessary to sustain the economy through this very difficult time. It's ultimately been a very successful policy intervention. But the effects of that should be relatively temporary. So if you take this chart, which is with some of the work the council's done, this is our seasonally adjusted monthly version of the Exchequer data. You can see that revenue is actually above its 2019 level and is recovering quite strongly. But you can see that spending jumped up, went down, jumped up, but it's still at a pretty high level. And that's partly because the supports for the economy around COVID were mostly on the spending side. And that part should wind down. But it's also because there were quite big permanent measures in budget 2021. The budget 2021 was actually a very expansionary budget, even if you take out the temporary COVID measures. Of course, there's a risk that measures that were announced as being temporary might become permanent. As I think also was mentioned, the political climate has changed a lot after COVID. And perhaps the pressure to have a bigger state to spend more is going to be there more persistently. But that's basically, I think, where we start from in terms of the COVID crisis. The other very important thing that happened was over the summer was the summer economic statement being put out. So the government had committed to a medium-term plan to 2025 in the programme for government. We now have that plan in July. If you want to read in more detail exactly what the council thinks about that plan, you can read our pre-budget statement. The link is there. It came out this morning. But basically, in terms of what the government plans to do, you can see it in this top left-hand chart. So they have this spending rule for spending to rise at what they view to be a sustainable rate at about 5%. It's supposed to be the growth, potential growth of the economy. You can see that basically total revenue is fairly flat as a share of national income. And that's basically because they're little tax cuts, but not very big. The economy is growing, so that brings in more tax revenue. And there's a bit of an impact from corporation tax, assumed to take a hit from international development. You can see that current spending picks up a little bit as a share of national income. But the main thing is that public investment, the dark line at the bottom, is increasing very substantially. And if you look at the right-hand chart, public investment over a 10-year period is set to triple the share of national income and to reach really record levels by Irish standards and actually pretty high standards by sort of international experience as well. And what the government is doing really is it's having this big increase in investment. It's also having tax cuts and some increase in day-to-day spending. So there's a lot of pressure on the public finances. And this basically leads to quite a significant structural deficit that will remain around 2 or 3% in the outer years. There's forecast, and it means that public debt will stay at this level. As I say, there's much more on that in the pre-budget statement. But I want to look a bit further ahead, more in the medium and long term. I think the pressures on the public finances in that period are well known, and they're all pressures that are going to be much more intensive than they were between this 2015-2019 period. I think was actually a bit of a sweet spot for the public finances in Ireland. One thing is to reduce the over-reliance on corporation tax. That's about 1 in 5 euros of tax revenue is coming from those sources. Population aging is really going to start accelerating in the later part of this decade and beyond. Climate change, we just had a session on that, but the investment needs on that are absolutely huge. There's implementation of stauncher care. It's pretty unusual for a country not to have a universal healthcare system, particularly in Europe. So this is an important reform to make, but it costs money. And in the longer term, growth may be lower. I think many of the people listening to this will be very familiar with these arguments. I'm not going to go through them all. I've just highlighted a couple. So one is the climate change. This is kind of what we were discussing in the previous session. If you look at the difference between projected emissions and the on the left and the bar on the right, which is the target, you can see the measures that have been built in so far are quite small relative to the total need. The back of the envelope calculation based on this more sophisticated analysis from the IMF suggests this might create an investment need of 7 billion euros a year, 3.5% of national income. Absolutely huge. And hopefully we'll get more detail on that in the autumn, including in the NDP. And of course, that's absolutely necessary. One other thing is over the long term, and really we're talking further ahead, Ireland's experience of growth has been pretty spectacular as well. So I look back over the 2019-2015 period, the nominal growth of GNI star was almost 8%. The average growth of national income in the euro area was about 3%. So Ireland's really been doing spectacularly well for quite a long time. If you look across different regions in Europe, you can see that you have a higher level of productivity to start with. You tend to grow much more slowly. And at some point, that dynamic is likely to kick in for Europe, for Ireland. And that is essentially what we think makes the most plausible scenario. There'll be much slower growth in the long term. And that will make the environment much harder for the public. Now, I want to talk you through a simple framework. This is basically how I've learned being on the council to think about the public finances, but I think it's quite revealing. So if you start from this is a very simple equation. So the budget balance, right, depends on the difference between revenue and spending. Now, revenue basically grows in line with the economy. And so if you have a stable, whatever stable, sustainable, medium-term growth rate you have for the economy, that's more or less how revenue is going to grow. It might even grow a bit faster. That elasticity is probably a bit bigger. On the spending side, what we focus on at the council is what we call the standstill. That's the cost of maintaining in real terms the same value of social benefits and the same value of public services. So this is basically correcting for inflation, but we also take into account demographics. And the thing about that is it typically, or at least in recent years, has grown slower than revenue. Okay. So as time goes forward, revenue is growing at one speed and the standstill needs are growing a bit less. And that means that growth generates some net fiscal space for new projects. There's money that you can use for new stuff. That might be cutting taxes, or it might be raising spending. But there is space to expand things in a sustainable way. Because the chart on the right shows the cost of standing still, just this is essentially inflation adjustment and the demographic adjustment. It's quite a lot. It's somewhere around 2.5 billion a year. And so as a result, there's much less fiscal space than most people think, including, I would say, most politicians. They tend to think in cash terms and thinking, oh, we can spend 4 billion this year. But actually, for 2.5 of that, it's just to stand still. The margin by which you can improve public services through growth is actually quite small. And I think that's quite an important thing for people to understand. And there's more on the council's fiscal standstill scenario if you follow that link. So this dynamic, where as time goes forward, the revenue is growing faster than the standstill spending, it's going to get much more challenging in the years ahead compared to this 2015-19. And that basically reflects two things. In the medium term, it reflects this chart on the left. And this is based on the SES. So the yellow line is how much fiscal space the government thinks is available. It's actually the gross measure that includes the standstill. And on the right is how much they've actually allocated spending cap, spending increases and tax cuts. And you can see that amount is actually bigger. So one of the things as we stand here today, the government has essentially allocated all of the space growth is going to generate between now and 2025 and a bit more. So that's why there's very little if you stick within the plans, there is expansion of investment, current spending, and this kind of thing. But there's no more space to add anything on top of it without putting the public finances on a less sustainable path. And in the long run, there's a slightly different dynamic, which is as revenue growth slows a bit, the economy grows more slowly, particularly as demographics kicks in. This dynamic, where as time goes on, we get a bit of fiscal space every year, it goes into reverse. That means that just to meet the cost of higher pensions and inflation, that actually costs more than the additional revenue that growth is bringing in. So every year, you're going to have to think about where the money comes from. And that's why reforming the pension system is such an important issue. So both in the medium term and in the longer term, we're going to see these much more uncomfortable dynamics around the public sector. And that's something we need to factor into our decisions today, because many of them will have long consequences. So what does this mean for the management of public spending? Well, as I said, I think Ireland is used to relatively favourable conditions. And every year we basically have this process. We've had this process where the focus has been on how much cash there is on budget day and then kind of how it's distributed to different people. And growth, the sort of net fiscal space really, been used to fund new activities. So in a way, that's a very nice combination, but it means you don't really have to make any hard choices because there's always some margin of growth that you can use to pay for things. And as you can see over this period, this measure we call net policy spending, and this excludes investment. We see that spending was growing quite fast over this 15-19 period. So we're used to an environment where spending is growing quite fast, so that's actually going to be much more difficult to sustain in the future. And the way budgeting has worked, at least until recently, is that basically the government would put these spending projections that were almost flat. It didn't take into account the standstill costs. And then as time went on, it revised them up. So if you look at, for example, 2018, this bottom line, budget 2013, 5 years before, we were spending 60 billion. In the end, we actually spent 75 billion. So this is a pretty bad way to do budgeting in our view. There's just this revision going up. And some of that revision is just predictable because we always knew the government wasn't going to close down the welfare system or the hospitals, right? So just paying for these things needs to be factored in. And then these overruns would get built into the base. A very special case, which a lot of people know about, we've seen a lot of discussion about, is health. Now, health's actually a bit strange because in most areas, by the time you get to the budget for next year is actually right. They build in the costs of providing public services next year, and then they hit the target, and that's fine. But in health, if you look on the left-hand side, that's actually not what happened. Not what happened. The blue bars show what the government planned in the budget before. The total bar is what they actually spent. So you can see that actually over this period, almost half of the increase in health spending was not planned for. But you can also see that the amount that was planned for, if you compare it to this dotted line, which is a sort of rough estimate of the standstill costs, costs of essentially continuing to provide the same services, wasn't actually enough to cover that. But something very strange was going on in the budgeting for health, but we ended up with these very large overruns totaling around 500 million a year. And often they'd appear in like November with no real sign that they were coming. It's a very strange dynamic going on there. And how was this funded? Well, you sort of see this on the right-hand chart. That pink area shows unexpected corporation tax receipts, and the red area shows the additional health spending. So basically what was happening is they were under budgeting on health. Health is obviously like a third of public spending, right? So it's a really big category. They weren't budgeting for it properly, and then they were paying for it with money from corporation tax receipts. And then that was being locked into the base for last year's, the following year. So one of the reasons we become so reliant on corporation tax is because of this dynamic. So it shows how budgeting can be very important in terms of what ultimately happens. So the risks of what's essentially been the current approach, and there's actually been some progress on this in the summary economic statement. They now have this thing called the existing level of service, which is essentially the same as the stats. So they have improved this, but at least what's been true up to now, the number of risks, right? One is pro-cyclicality, or you spend windfalls. So money comes in either because the cycle's stronger than you thought, or because there's a windfall, and then you spend that money. If I have it, I spend it, and then you're doing the wrong thing from a cyclical perspective, and the structural position of the budget balance is getting off track. I think a reasonable question, I don't have a firm answer to this, but I don't think it's a system that really encourages good medium-term planning or very good focus on actually making good use of the money that you have. It obviously increases the risks of borrowing too much, because all the focus is on getting extra resources into the system, not on how resources are being allocated and used. And it means you can't really have a credible framework budgetary planning because you keep having to revise it. So on the right-hand side, you can see the expenditure ceiling framework in 2013. The idea is there's a multi-annual ceiling for spending, but basically that gets revised up every year. And so it's essentially not a multi-annual framework in any meaningful sense. So it's not a credible framework to control spending over the medium. So I think there's an alternative approach, and that starts with having realistic aggregate spending numbers. This is the existing level of service factored into the SES. And that would allow you to have these multi-year expenditure ceilings that don't change. And a very good example, I think the best example I'm aware of, is what they do in the Netherlands, where basically at each program for go, they always have these big coalitions, and then they have a medium-term projection of the economy that's produced by their fiscal council. Not advocating that for Ireland, speaks to the fact. And then they, in the negotiations coalition, they agree what they're going to do over the next 5 years, and that's basically what they do. And they have genuine multi-year frameworks. And this approach is very popular in the academic literature. The advantages are that it's less likely to be pro-cyclical. I think it sets out the budgetary choices politicians face very clearly. Spending should be more predictable. Perhaps it increases the focus on medium-term value for money, and it helps having a sort of credible framework. To be fair, there are two possible disadvantages. One is if it's not credible, these profiles might be taken as a starting point, and then people bid up from there. And I think that's probably what the Department of Finance worry about. And also what happens if you have major changes. So one of the very interesting innovation the UK had about 2 years ago was to have a 5-year envelope for the NHS, for the health system, which had never done before. Then COVID came along. So it's the worst possible time to move to a medium-term framework. You have to have some flexibility somewhere. I think one thing that would underpin all of this, and perhaps others on the panel, I'm sure know more about this than me, is I think making one of the things is that by having this good budgeting, it should help to make best use of public resources, and making best use of public resources should reduce the pressure on having to borrow more to basically meet social objectives. And I think that, to me, there seems to be a lack of economic analysis to underpin these decisions. So for example, if you take staunch care, a really major reform, the most recent costing comes from 2017. A lot's happened over the last 4 years. And it's really not even that costing, there's a lot of information that I think could be improved. If you look at Housing for All, a really major program of government investment and spending, there's very little economic information in analysis in that document. I think spending reviews is something we've often looked to in the council as well, to allocate resources better and to see which programs might be expanded because they work well, or which are less efficient. I think recent spending reviews have had a lot of good analysis in them, but they've not really tackled these hard questions in a very coherent way. There's a lot on forecasting and what's going on, which is interesting, and a lot of good information to collect, but it's not really helping underpin the allocation of resources. And I think there also needs to be, in the budgeting practices, more weight in the decision-making on these kinds of evidence-based approaches. It's very hard to see how the evidence is really entering into the process. I think the final point is that some of this raises some very fundamental questions about the kind of country Ireland wants to be. It seems to me from the outside in a way that Ireland's had an incredible economic history over the last 25 years, right? But the Celtic Tiger years, the boom years, the bust years, the recovery period. And it's still to me not very clear whether Ireland views itself as a sort of low tax country with the public services you get if you pay low taxes, or whether it views itself as a more higher tax, more social country. And I think those questions are not really resolved. I don't know if they need to be or whether they will be, but I think these questions do raise bigger questions that can be raised and can be answered in a single budget. I think these are big questions about the future direction of society, about fairness between generations. So let me conclude with 3 quick final remarks. So I would argue that Ireland is going to face this more difficult environment for financing public services in the years ahead, notwithstanding a number of positive developments in the fact interest rates and so on. The second is, I think, sound management of the public finances and efficient and fair choices about spending taxation are mutually reinforcing. I think the more effective government is, the less the temptation is just to throw more money at problems and borrow more money to do that. But I think it does mean that there are some genuine choices to be made about society. And I think one of the themes of our report today is in the way those choices often get fudged. If you want to see how grim it is to be the finance minister, you should go on our fiscal space calculator and you can see, I mean, it's really frustrating, right? There's, if I think we all have some vision, if I was in charge of the country, I would do X, Y, and Z. But X, Y, and Z typically are going to cost money, and where are you going to get it from? These are really, really hard choices. I'm very glad that I just analysed them rather than have to make them. But I think as a society, these are big choices that hang over us. Thanks very much.
Mila Magat, Sebastian, thank you very, very much. I hope Ministers Donoghue and McGrath are listening. I'm sure they're tuning in. Just to remind you that the Fiscal Council pre-budget statement 2022 is available on fiscalcouncil.ie. And to remind you that all the slides and presentations from this week will be on our website on dublineconomics.com. As with other sessions, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen. Leverdal Shol Vergoid Keshtana Istiach. Thank you very, very much, Sebastian. So, the next speaker on this topic will be Colin McCarthy. Colin, the screen is
yours. Okay, well, thanks very much, Ciarán. I'd just like to add a brief comment to what Sebastian was talking about, and he mentioned the risks to corporation tax revenue, which have been well flagged. Minister of Finance Pascal Donoghue has made it clear that he expects some diminution in corporation tax revenue in the years ahead. Figures have been surprisingly good this year, though. And the gossip, depends who you gossip with, but people I gossip with include accountants and tax people and so on. And they told me something that's a little bit disturbing. Some of the companies, big multinational companies that operate here, including some of the banks and the IFSC, have a capacity to accelerate revenue from future years by getting people to prepay. You need to know who you're dealing with to do that, but they do. And pay the corporation tax on today's terms upfront, including this year. But obviously, from the state's point of view, that involves borrowing some tax revenue from future years into this year. I wonder if the authorities are fully alert to this, because it means that there could be a weakness in corporation tax revenue in the years ahead, even if there's no change in the worldwide corporation tax regime. Now, that could happen too, and it could happen in ways that would hurt corporation tax revenues here. So if this is truly going on, it will not flag itself with revenue commissioners in the form of prepayments by the companies that are paying the tax. It will take the form of prepayments to them by their customers. I wonder if the authorities have spotted that this is happening. Given the numbers concerned, it might not be trivial, but I just made that comment by way of reinforcing whatever nervousness Sebastian may have induced in you all. I really want to talk about the capital program, and we all learn in the textbooks that you should try to use the capital program as far as you can to offset volatility in the economy. I think we all know that we've done the reverse here in Ireland. It's almost a tradition. Small open economies, a lot of evidence on this, tend to be a little bit more volatile than larger ones for all sorts of reasons. The volatility here in Ireland has been exacerbated for a long time by a pro-cyclical capital investment policy. And those of you who remember the fiscal correction at the end of the 1980s will recall that quite a lot of that fiscal correction took the form not of the very widely discussed economies in current spending. There were some. That was the first board snip, as it was called, when Ray McSherry was Minister of Finance in 1987, 88, 89 period. But actually, if you look at the figures, which some people do, and not everybody, you'll see the tax revenue rose and the capital budget was slashed. The headlines this week in Britain were about the Treasury reimposing their discipline on everybody else through increases in payroll tax, and they cancelled Boris's tunnel from Scotland to Northern Ireland and so on. This is what tends to happen when governments eventually decide, or the Treasury departments get on top and say, look, we have to fix things. The debt and deficit numbers look too bad. They're right or wrong. But the form that the adjustment takes is usually increases in taxes and cuts in the capital budget. And that's been the pattern here. It was the pattern, if you look at the data in 88, 89, 1991. After the currency crisis, which was 1992, 93, the government capital budget, which had been cut by quite a lot, it then doubled in the years up to the year 2000. So it had kind of recovered to a decent level by the year 2000. And it had reached about 4 billion. But it then doubled again through the bubble period. And it had actually reached 9 billion by the time that the bubble finally burst in 2008. No surprises for what happened next. There were increases in taxes and the capital program was slashed. And that has been the traditional response of Irish governments when they get into fiscal trouble. And the next slide makes that point again. The capital budget was halved by 2011, just 3 years. And those 3 years in which the economy was flattened by the banking crisis, credit crunch, a country ended up in an IMF program in the autumn of 2010 for the first time. The capital budget was halved and it stayed below 4 billion until 2016. Inevitably, with a low capital program like that, people begin to complain about scarcities of public infrastructure, including public housing. There's very little local authority building in those years. Indeed, some local authority houses disappeared from the stock because they were sold off to tenants at discounted prices. And the number of local authority units available in many local authority areas actually fell. Unrepaired roads, the road maintenance budget was slashed. The water company was deprived of revenue because government said water's free, in urban areas anyway. There is a huge backlog of water investment and so on. So I think it's pretty clear that the cutbacks in the capital budget back in the post-crash years were unfortunate, and there were a lot of battles fought and lost by officials in the Department of Finance and elsewhere to try to get a better balance and try and achieve greater economies on the current side, the better to preserve most of the capital program. Now, the capital program had swollen, and there was a lot of foolish and silly projects in it. Unfortunately, the mechanism that is always used to slow down an overambitious capital program is to complete whatever you've started. And if you complete whatever you've started, but don't start anything else, then the program does fall quite quickly, 2-3 years, and the annual expenditure on capital will shrink quite a lot. But of course, it means that you complete the projects from the bubble. And some of the projects in the bubble may be pretty silly ones that didn't make any sense. There are now 3 airports in Ireland that have had no flights at all. 2 of them were formally closed. The one in Waterford has no flights, but it's had no flights for 5 years, but it's not closed, and so on. So all sorts of silly things get completed because they've been started. And of course, some smart and valuable projects that you would really like to have gone ahead with never get started, and they get deferred. And they even run out of planning consents. There are now some schemes I'm aware of around the country that have to start from scratch, new planning applications, public consultations, and high court reviews and all the rest of it. Projects that were actually in the program 10 years ago and fell victim to the slashing of the capital program. There's another hidden cost in a pro-cyclical capital spending regime. And the hidden cost is that, and it was very visible in 2011, 12, 13, 14, the construction industry was very flat. Construction value for money was very good for a while. And of course, the government was out of the market. And while there were bargains on offer, the government was not at the sales. So the position bluntly is that far from acting to stabilize economic activity, it's kind of pretty clear that the public capital program here in Ireland has been an independent source of macroeconomic instability, on top of which the stop-start pattern delivers poor value. Just recently, and I think I'm right in saying that all of these things really emerged in the last 12 months. There have been 3 extraordinary debacles concerning really big projects. A project that's $1 billion or the best part of $1 billion or a couple of billion. It's a very big project in Ireland. They don't arise all that often. And 3 of them have gone really badly wrong just recently. The first was the National Broadband Plan, and it went wrong to the point where the officials rejected and publicly the economic appraisal that had been prepared by the project's promoters, which was the Department of Communications. And the government decided to go ahead with it regardless. I'll come back to the question of poor cost-benefit studies in a moment. The second is the National Children's Hospital, which is under construction in a site which all independent observers found this to be a very surprising choice. And it's going to cost double or more than double of what it was meant to cost. And the third is a maternity hospital, which people think has not yet started. Actually, some bits of it have been built in advance of sanction, also in a curiously chosen location. These are both national facilities. It's a national children's hospital, national maternity hospital, and both of them have been cunningly located in traffic black holes in the inner suburbs of Dublin, which is not smart. And both of them look like they're going to cost at least double what they were supposed to cost, including double what they were supposed to cost just recently. And One of them, it has been alleged, is going to cost something like 4 times the figure when initial political sanction was given. So this week, we've come across 2 interesting examples for future capital. One of them is a project to spend 200 million for a yacht race in Cork. And the Irish Times, I think it was, reported that Ireland was in competition with Valencia in Spain and Saudi Arabia for this valuable event. Well, Valencia pulled out last week. I think that hasn't been reported in the Irish papers yet. A lot of journalists in Ireland don't have a Google facility on their laptops, but the local politicians in Valencia decided that 200 million quid to run a race was not a good idea. There has also been a cost-benefit study, which reportedly has identified 500 million in benefits, prepared by Ernst & Young, on which the project promoters are relying. The study is unpublished, and we'll see whether the government goes along with this extraordinary scheme. If there is a constant in the international literature on the evaluation of public investment projects, it is the following: run the Winter Games, the Summer Games, the World Cup, yacht races for a few weeks with very expensive facilities always costs an absolute fortune and never delivers the benefits that are trotted out by the proponents of these projects. The last people foolish enough to host this yacht race were New Zealand. It's documented that it cost a fortune. I think I'm right in saying that the city of Montreal still has debt on its balance sheet from the hosting the Olympic Games back in the 1970s. And it's kind of disappointing to see this stuff even being contemplated. More importantly, and you're now talking serious money, Eamon Ryan and his colleague in Northern Ireland, Eamon Ryan is Minister for Transport, they've commissioned the engineers over Europe to consider the case for an all-Ireland network of high-speed railway lines. And he has specifically mentioned a high-speed route that would connect Donegal to Cork. I don't know what daily passenger traffic is between Donegal and Cork, but I imagine for the cost of a high-speed rail length, you could buy them an airplane each, and you'd save piles of money. This is meant to connect Donegal and Derry to Belfast, Dublin to Cork, and is meant to be the link to Limerick and so on and so on. High-speed rail costs, if it means what I presume it means, 300 kilometers an hour, it costs 30 million per kilometer in open country and up to 100 million per kilometer in the suburbs of cities. It's just phenomenally expensive. And vast quantities of money have been spent on high-speed railway lines that lose money, especially in Spain, but also to a large degree in France and in a few other countries around Europe. The HS2 proposal in Britain has proven to be very controversial, and the estimates now are over 100 billion for a route from London up to the north of England. Again, it's kind of depressing that, or depresses me that the Transport Minister has endorsed the case for high-speed rail in Ireland in advance of the availability of OVR's report. I've little doubt that OVR, who are a reputable outfit, will draw the Minister's attention to the fact that there really aren't very many passengers for existing rail in Ireland, and that the cities that he's proposing to link, including terminus cities for high-speed railway lines, if they go ahead, will be the smallest terminus cities for high-speed railway lines in the world by a mile. The kinds of cities you need to justify the cost. There are very few pairs of cities in Europe that generate sufficient traffic to justify the cost. I was sitting with some Spanish colleagues many years ago, asking them why Madrid to Seville, which is not a big city, was chosen for the first line in Spain, and they all laughed. And I said, well, why are you laughing? It's a straightforward question. Why wasn't Madrid to, say, Barcelona? And I said, the reason is because Felipe Gonzalez is not from Barcelona, he's from Seville. And that line, of course, has lost piles of money. Anyway, the mistakes available in this area include small ones, but they include very big ones. If I can finish quickly, the first version of the public spending code actually dates back to Circular 1 of 1983 from the Department of Finance. It's been updated and it's constantly been modified. And it was a response to a report that had just come out called the Report of the Working Group, Deja Vu, on cost overruns on public construction contracts. And I quote there remarks by John Bruton, who was Minister of Finance at the time. On the 21st of December 1981, he addressed this group at his first meeting, and he said he wanted them to consider measures to avoid non-viable investment decisions and to reduce the increases in costs in public contracts during construction. And the group recommended, would you believe, cost-benefit appraisals in advance and firm cost estimates prior to political commitment. Those same recommendations could profitably be made today. And the public spending code, as practiced, is a kind of a self-regulation thing. It's not really enforced on anybody. It's voluntary, and the people who promote projects commission the cost-benefit studies. The conflict of interest is pretty plain. A lot of the cost-benefit studies are very poor, even when they're published. I can't remember a significant project that was stopped because the cost-benefit appraisal commissioned by the promoters turned out to be negative. I can't think of a case of that happening in recent times. So it seems to me that self-regulation in this instance, as in so many others, doesn't work. I think it's time to place the public spending code on a statutory basis. And that would include a Public Investment Act, which would make it impossible for a project to be even considered for exchequer funds until an appraisal had been published, a proper appraisal, commissioned by the Department of Finance or Public Expenditure, and with no more studies prepared by consultants to the project promoters. We've tried that and we know it doesn't work. I'm not saying that no project could go ahead unless approved in this independent fashion. Of course, the government is responsible to the electorate, and the government ought to have the power to override the advice of people who do appraisals. But they should be required to do it, and required to do it in public, as they did with the broadband plan. It was quite clear with the broadband plan that the officials had decided that the investment appraisal was not credible. That was the precise language they used. And the minister said we'd fire ahead anyway. It's my belief that ministers might do that from time to time if we had a proper Public Investment Act, but it would set the bar a bit higher. And it would put a stop to these spurious cost-benefit studies that are constantly being pumped out. It seems to me that 40 years of pretending to manage the capital program is quite enough. I'm going to finish with a prediction. I think there will be increases in taxes over the next few years. I don't know which ones, I don't know when. And I'm fearful that when the National Development Plan review is published shortly, it will be very ambitious and bits of it will be abandoned 2 or 3 years down the road in the course of the next fiscal correction. In other words, the tradition of pro-cyclical investment policy will continue, at least for now. Thanks.
Colm, thank you very, very much. Another excellent presentation. Thank you. Please remember to put your questions in the Q&A. I'm sure we'll hear from loads of Corkonians telling us why they're worth it and why it's worth spending 200 million on their yacht race. And of course they would beat Valencia and any city in the world because they're the best. But all joking aside, sorry, cost overruns are absolutely no laughing matter. And even more seriously or sadly, I think, is that there'll be a human cost to this. As Colm said, the National Maternity Hospital and the National Children's Hospital have been built in traffic bottlenecks. It will have a human cost, which is probably much more serious than the financial or economic cost. Gormila Magat Colm, thank you very much. Another exposition probably of your famous phrase that rubber wheels are less expensive than steel wheels, and building a high-speed network from Donegal to Cork probably isn't the best way to use our finance. I would be very interested to hear of the smart, valuable projects, a number of examples that have been ditched because of this crazy pro-cyclical policy that we seem not to be able to get away from. Politicians, it seems to be inevitable with the political system and political cycle we have. It is my great pleasure to now introduce Michael Taft. Michael, we are extremely grateful you came to us at very short notice, and we're very, very grateful that you have stepped into the void, and the screen is now yours, Michael.
Okay, thank you very much. I didn't have time to prepare a PowerPoint, didn't have much time to prepare this. So I will present this in old school without a PowerPoint. And what I will do is kind of maybe use an inductive process. I'll just focus on a few kind of small examples, small things, and see from that, can we build up build ourselves up to kind of more general observations regarding this issue of spending and tax revenue. And I want to start with three little areas, small in the broader sense of things, but very important to so many people. First off is childcare. Ireland wins the Triple Crown when it comes to childcare. We have the highest childcare fees in the EU. And in fact, when compared to other high-income countries, we're charging 180 euros a week for full-time childcare, whereas in those countries, they are charging 30, 40, 50 euros a week. We have some of the lowest paid workers in the childcare sector, both domestically and in international comparison. And thirdly, this has led to a crisis in the childcare system itself. 40% staff turnover in the childcare sector. There literally are people who are very highly qualified in this sector, but who are now taking up jobs in retail because it pays more, and they feel they have a longer term interest in that. So we would have to spend about €1 billion more than what we're spending now to reach the EU average on early education and childcare support. But there is no doubt that if we poured that money into the current model, we would still be talking about childcare as a crisis mode, because over the last few years, we've seen a significant increase in expenditure, but no movement on these three trophies, if you will. And I think this is what happens when you try to run a public service along market lines. What we need are publicly accountable markets. And in the case of childcare, that would be regulated fees and regulated wages. In such a system, you would be making a significant economic and, I would argue, fiscal contribution, whereas now it is a drain with very little impact. Secondly, I mean, what is it? What would you say to an idea that we can increase tax revenue, support sustainable domestic demand, and therefore induce further private investment and reduce public spending without anything to do with the budget or the finance bill? Okay, let's see if we can try that. Give workers the tools in the workplace to actually achieve those goals. And what I'm speaking of is particularly to give them the right to bargain collectively. Give them the right to push up wage floors and force low-road businesses to internalize what are now negative externalities, which cost the economy and the exchequer so much. We have a low pay crisis in this country. 1 in 5 workers are officially categorized as low pay. We have one of the highest levels of wage inequality. This is economically inefficient, fiscally degrading, never mind being a social obscenity. If you gave people that right, you would get higher tax revenue, reduced social protection supports, and you'd have a better fiscal outcome. So all this comes from changing the power relationships in the economy, and in this instance in particular, changing the power relationships in the workplace. A third area is, the issue of promoting productivity, especially in the public sector, to get better outcomes for the same amount of money you're investing, or to get multiples of the outcome for any additionality. Now, look at what the government did during the austerity period, which goes back to 2009, 2010. They claimed to be engaged in public sector reform, but actually they carpet bombed the public sector. They went around saying, oh, look at this. We reduced the number of people employed in the public sector. We reduced the exchequer pay bill. And they were congratulating themselves that they had done this all in the name of fiscal contraction. However, at the same time, both the SRI and NERI were showing that if you reduced public sector employment, you would likely drive up the deficit and drive up the debt. And the reason why that perverse outcome is a common sense observation. If in the middle of a jobs recession, you start cutting jobs, little good will come of it. So what would be the alternative to driving public sector reform, and in particular driving up productivity? And that is by actually privileging those who produce the goods and services from the public sector. By the way, this applies also to the private sector. In other words, privileging the employees' role in policymaking through employee-driven innovation, programs of which are run throughout the continent, especially at local and regional levels. Who better than the people who produce these goods and services to know the pitfalls, to deal with the bureaucracies and mixed signals, and to come up with better ideas? In fact, so, what we can draw from this, and if we want to channel Thomas Jefferson, who purportedly said, probably apocryphal, but nonetheless made an observation, when there's a problem in the governance of people, there's only one solution: more and more democracy. So don't run public services along public lines, create publicly accountable services. Transform the power relationships in the workplace throughout the economy, and introduce more democracy, more inclusion, more participation. So those are just 3 small examples that we can start to build up in terms of creating a resilient economy and a resilient fiscal, resilient public finances. But let's go on to the more difficult questions of spending on public services and the revenue that will needed to spend on that. Of course, we have to substantially increase public spending on public services. Not all services, we have to be more forensic on that, but in the totality, especially when we compare ourselves to our peer group in the EU, that is other small open economies that use actually collective consumption as not only to bring about social prosperity, but to even act as an automatic stabilizer, privileging collective over individual consumption. In the first instance, to get to that stage, we need to shake ourselves free from the balanced budget obsession. And here, of course, we're not masters of our own fate. We're not in control here. This is as much to do at the EU levels and the decisions they make. We need to go back to the golden rule, which is to balance or even run a slight surplus on current spending and borrow for productive investment, with all the caveats that Colin mentioned in terms of ensuring that that productive investment is efficient and optimal. The EU, for instance, is considering a green golden rule, whereby green investment is exempt from deficit and debt calculations. This would be a significant advance, considering the existential crisis that climate chaos exposes us to. But it also shows the extent to which deficits and debts are politically constructed, as much as being a kind of a balance sheet fact. When is a deficit not a deficit? When policymakers and statisticians in Luxembourg say so. But in terms of the fiscal rules, the government will have to decide what side of the fiscal rules are they on. In the summer economic statement in 2019, they said they would not proceed on the basis of the fiscal rules. They said that application of the fiscal rules to the Irish economy was inappropriate. In fact, they even used the word dangerous when they said what would happen if we followed the fiscal rules. Now, of course, that's quite a turnaround from just a few years previously during the debates. I'm sure people remember during the fiscal treaty debates, where it would be dangerous if we didn't pass the fiscal rules. So in one sense, going forward, the government's going to have to decide their approach to those fiscal rules. But listen, even if we free ourselves from this balanced budget obsession, we will need to raise revenue to balance or even run a small surplus on the current side. So where does that revenue come from? Well, there are two areas that when actually you compare ourselves to our peer group in the EU, there are two areas where there are outliers. So the first area is just to kind of think of this as a thought experiment. The central bank estimates that net household worth is 800 billion euros. Now, if you were to apply a small 3% levy to that, what would happen? It would raise as much money as income tax. Now, of course, it wouldn't do that. It's quite simplistic. Much of the net assets are internationally mobile, hard to get at, whatever. But it just shows you what this does is this thought experiment. It suggests that increased taxation on capital, on assets, on wealth should come before taxes on labor in terms of raising the revenue we need to have sustainable public services going forward. But this raises problems. And I think that, what Sebastian referred to, the difficult decisions we will have to make. There are many things I don't understand in life. I'll admit that. But here are some things, in particular to property. How is it that parties and politicians on county councils, city councils, local authorities are cutting property tax at the same time as we're having a housing crisis? Why is the property tax only levied on some types of property and not other types of property, namely financial property or financial assets? Why should someone inherit 150,000 euros that they didn't do anything to earn through inheritance and pay nothing, while someone, an employee or self-employed, on 10 times and even more or less than that, end up paying tax, PSI, USC? And finally, why should someone who bought a house for £40,000 in the 1980s or 90s and now can sell that in multiples of that, and I'm talking multiples of that amount, and yet their capital gain is not taxed? Taxing capital on the same basis as labor would be a good start. Tax assets, tax wealth, tax capital, we can start to make things better. The second area is, for instance, social insurance, and in particular, employee social insurance. That's where we're a real outlier when we compare ourselves either to the EU average or to small open economies. we would need to double employers' social insurance to reach the EU average, though there is the issue of a pension demographic issue of that, which you have to take into account. The great thing is that this is not a tax. It is part of employees' compensation. It should be part of a wage negotiation. And if it could be integrated into a national collective bargaining structure, we could ensure a smoother transition to a high-waged economy, and therefore raise revenue, which could promote social protection, which in turn promotes tax revenue, which can then help sustain public services and social protection in the process. But again, it comes to a problem. When the Commission on Pensions recently said that they wanted to increase the pension age, but also what was needed was an increase in self-employed PRSI, we now have parties scrambling to get onto Morning Ireland to say they won't raise social insurance on PRSI, though everybody knows, the dogs in the street know, IBEC, SIPTU, the government knows, and it's even alluded to in the program for government, the social insurance will have to increase. So those are just the points. I mean, we can take steps in terms of revising the economic practices and structures which actually feed in to the fiscal position of the economy. But I think, Ciarán, you mentioned something, but I think that John Maynard Keynes was raised in some earlier session. Good, no better person to refer to than John Maynard Keynes. I'll leave you with this. He was writing towards the end of World War II and having debates, and he was getting exacerbated by these debates, because obviously he was saying they would have to massive rebuilding of housing stock, massive rebuilding of physical stock, massive rebuilding in infrastructure, and he was constantly being met with the objection, how do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? How do you pay for it? And finally he said, if you can actually do it, you can afford to do it. If you have the labor, if you have the materials, if you have the knowledge capital, if you have the innovative strategy and practices to actually do something, you can afford to do it. Because by actually doing it, it helps you afford to do it. Thanks very much, Ciarán.
Thank you very, very much, Michael. You've raised a number of very, very interesting points there and interesting ideas on how do we pay for it. Interesting to note, €180 a week for childcare is quite a lot less than I paid back in the day, a good few years ago, and not a very salubrious part of town either. And very interesting that you note that we need to taxes on wealth. You must have been watching the Met Gala last night, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's dress where she had, tax the rich. And it seemed to me long ago you used to see eat the rich, but at least now they're taxing the rich. So we've got a little more pacifist.
Well, I'm putting her dress as a screensaver.
We're gone a bit more pacifist in our approach. But to get more serious, I mean, your point on social insurance payments is very well made. And I'd like to put it to both you, Sebastian and Colm as well. There's a question in from Laura Bambrick, a very interesting question. She would like to hear the panel's thoughts on Boris Johnson's new health and social care levy. Do you think it will work? Do you think it will resolve the social care funding crisis? And should we follow his lead? Sebastian, if you'd like to answer that, please, first, and then we'll come to Colm.
I'm not a politician, but I find the politics of that fascinating. You have a Tory prime minister who claims to be from the low tax party and who raises taxes. So I think I pose that as a question. I think we've all seen that. And now that raises a question, I think, for Irish politics. Deeper down, I mean, the UK has actually had quite a fiscal struggle for a number of years for many reasons, many of which I think you're pretty aware of. We're pretty aware of in Ireland. So they're partly trying to fill a hole in the public finances. I think it's interesting that they extended the social insurance increase to pensioners. Now that's a big margin, right? Traditionally, pensioners were poor. Some pensioners still are very poor, but some are very affluent. It always drives me crazy when I take a long distance flight somewhere in the world off season, and it's full of 70-year-olds going to walk the Great Wall of China or going on holiday in Thailand. Now, when I know what the pension system looks like, That generation appears to have done quite well, particularly also from housing as well. So I think it's interesting from that perspective. What it doesn't do, I think, is again, it actually avoids some deeper questions. I think social care, particularly in the UK, as we've seen, is not that good. So that's the ultimate goal, right? That people need to be treated with dignity and well treated at the end of their lives. It's also phenomenally expensive, and the costs are going to rise very steeply, particularly as things like dementia take hold in society. And it's a real lot. Dying or needing care is a real lottery. There are some people who will live into fantastic age, to be playing tennis at the age of 95, and then one day will die in their sleep. There are other people that will need years of very intensive and very costly care. And the financial implications of that are totally different. So it's a system that really needs proper insurance. And the role of housing wealth in that is very important as well. The politics are very complicated. There seems to be a reluctance to use the value of people's houses to do that. People seem to be very attached for inheritance. But ultimately, there does really need to be there needs to be a new social settlement around that, just in the same way there's a sort of social settlement around other parts of healthcare, right? Essentially accept that quite a lot of it is taken care of by the government. There really needs, unemployment's another example, but then really needs to be a settlement for this problem. And it probably does involve, a very big change in the way we finance it and the way the whole system.
Yeah, well, one of the public perceptions about what we call PRSI in this country, parallel social insurance contributions, is that this is an insurance scheme. It's not an insurance scheme. The money goes into general revenue, and the same is really true with national insurance in the UK. There is a mythical fund here now called the Social Insurance Fund, which is really a book entry in the National Financial Accounts. A very cheeky backbench TD about 20 or 30 years ago asked the minister, in what type of assets was the Social Insurance Fund invested? And the minister had to concede that there isn't any social insurance fund. It's not invested in anything. This is not even an earmarked tax. It's a form of taxation on a particular definition of income. Whether it's actually paid by employers or employees has been investigated at great length. It's shifted, as we all know, and it is, whatever way you rinse it, mostly paid by employees ultimately. In Ireland, I don't know, we now have three different ways of taxing earned income. There is income tax, there is the universal social charge, and employee PRSI. There's a commission sitting again now. I'm sure they'll look again at this issue. Philosophically, I prefer to have one simple tax on income, and I'd like to see all income tax on the same basis from all sources. Politicians will run from that like the plague because the existing system, our systems, give them the opportunity to play all sorts of games. On what's been done in Britain, I really don't know whether the revenue will be adequate to fix the social care crisis. The money goes into the general pot in the Treasury. What gave me most satisfaction in Rishi Sunak's victory for the Treasury over Downing Street, which is what it was that the government were able to figure out that a tunnel from Scotland to Northern Ireland was a daft idea, and they figured it out without hiring anybody to do a cost-benefit study. They were able to do it in their own heads.
I would just make the point that the Social Insurance Fund is not actuarially based. It is not considered by Eurostat to be a proper social insurance fund as we think in the Bismarckian countries. That doesn't mean to say that there is not a linkage or a relationship between the contributions that are made and the benefits that are paid out. I know that if I pay the 4% and my employer pays the 11%, and I have the requisite number of qualifying conditions, which is approximately about a year. It's a little bit complex. I will receive, if I become short-term unemployed, X amount. If I become ill, I will receive X amount. If a woman becomes pregnant, she will receive X amount. So it's a weak relationship, but it's a relationship nonetheless. And it would be interesting if the Commission on Taxation looked at the possibility of creating a more robust social insurance fund, because it is not only something that employees, self-employed pay into, it's something that employers pay into. Colm is right to say that there's a questions of incidence, but what I understand and the kind of working thing that the trade union movement here in Ireland operates on is it's about a 50% incident rate. In other words, 1 percentage point increase in employer social insurance would half of it would be paid by employees, half of it would be paid by employers. And in the case of employees, it would not mean that their wage obviously would be cut. It wouldn't. It just means that it would slightly depress going forward wage increases. But on the issue of care, because I mean, the Fiscal Council has done a lot of work on the not only just the demographic costs in the short term, looking at, you think you may have this much money to spend, but really you're spending it just to stand still. But in the long-term costs, especially in the healthcare and long-term caring sector, there's going to be a considerable increase. And again, if we look at other EU countries, we find that through their social insurance or similar funds, they actually have a special category of social insurance that is to pay for nursing home or other kind of care for when it gets elderly. So that would, using social insurance as a pay-as-you-go model, which is very similar to the Exchequer, that would seem to be an interesting area to go through, but that would have to be split between employers, employees, and self-employed, unlike the Boris Johnson proposals, which actually landed on households, and the way they have their national insurance contributions structured is quite regressive. So, that there is an opportunity for that. And can I just say that in terms of seeing PRSI contributions as a solidarity contribution, because it's about, people pay according to their abilities and access these benefits according to their means, there's no reason, again, why that solidarity levy should not be levied on capital income as well.
Thank you, Michael. I'd like to address the old chestnut raised both by Sebastian and Colm, and again, it's not just an Irish phenomenon; it's around the world. One question is from, and it also addresses, I suppose, Michael's phrase, changing power relationships in the economy. A question from John Andrew Chetty. What do you see as the main reasons behind pro-cyclical decision-making, and why might it persist? And I think myself, it's the political system. And another question, again, are there any positive signs that the budgetary system has been evolving to avoid past mistakes being made again in Ireland? So if I could please come to Sebastian first, Colm, and then Michael. Thank you.
So I think, as you say, it's a well-known phenomenon. I think almost in all countries you have this, and that's why we've had a trend increase in public debt across the OECD over the last 30, 40 years. It's not that anyone thought that was a particularly good idea, it's just because it happened. And that partly, I think, also reflects the fact that social expectations have gone up, but the willingness to pay for them hasn't gone up at the same time. In many countries, the growth of living standards has slowed over that time as well. And so people were used to things getting better, and kind of the governments ended up trying to cover over the fact that wasn't happening because of public finances. So I think these pressures are always there. I think you can blame the political system, and I think there are features in the political system in Ireland which make it very responsive to some short-term pressures. So that's where we get the "if I have it, I spend it" kind of mentality. I think we shouldn't just blame the politicians. We should partly blame ourselves as well. We get the politicians in the way we deserve. perhaps, I don't know. But I think we like the idea of someone election time telling us things are going to be great, and we can have all this free stuff, and we're not really going to have to pay for it. And it's very interesting, actually, if you look at opinion polls, right? Most people are in favor of higher taxes. In general, they're not in favor of higher taxes for themselves. And so if they have to pay them, so it's two very different propositions. So it's an inherent feature of our lives, and that's why we have institutions to try and fix it. I think the situation has improved. I would claim in a modest way that the Fiscal Council, having a Fiscal Council, hopefully has contributed to that. I leave it to others to judge whether it has. I think, for example, actually this change to the existing level of service, this new assumption in the SES, if the government sticks to that, could be quite significant. And one thing we didn't have for years was a measure of the output gap in Ireland. We used to use this one from the Commission. The Department of Finance used to say it was useless, and then we'd carry on without anything. And now the council has been very active in developing that. Probably not a perfect measure of that, but at least it gives us some kind of a compass as to whether the economy is overheating or not. I think these things that sound a bit minor, but actually are significant. But I think more broadly, personally, the council's been going for 10 years. I think there's an ambiguity about how serious the government really is about this. So, so for example, most of the people, I guess the people listening to this, people relatively interested in fiscal policy, we've had 2 debt targets over the past decade. I guess most people listening to this can't remember that, or maybe didn't even notice at the time. And that just shows the lack of commitment. There were things that looked like they were stuck into the budget the last time, that someone noticed that the sort of debt at the end of the 5 years was where they wanted it and said, well, that's a debt target. A year later, we were having to email the Department of Finance, say, do you still have a debt target? And they weren't really sure. So it's partly about the political commitment, right? All these institutional things, and the Fiscal Council, as an example, partly relies on the political commitment. We can give you the advice. If the government doesn't want to follow it, it's their decision. Hopefully, we make it more costly for them to make bad policies, but we can't prevent that.
Exactly. And before I come to Colm, I'd like to throw in another one for you, Colm. Again, on the cyclicality, surely the benefit to be derived from the National Broadband Plan has been radically recontextualized by the pandemic, work from home, homeschooling, carbon savings from less travel, etc. Yeah, but God, it doesn't have to cost so much, does it?
Yeah, I mean, on the broader question of why we have persisted, and it looks like we're about to do it again, with a pro-cyclical public capital policy here. Ultimately, it's political. The capacity to accept that the capital program is a 5-year, 10-year time horizon activity, and to set a capital program in that timescale and then leave it alone over that timescale, which would bring great stability to the construction industry, which is a victim of the pro-cyclicality. Why that hasn't been done is just political. The political time horizon is too short, and politicians cannot resist the temptation to push pet projects and projects in their own locality and so on. Back in the 1990s, when the capital budget was rising, I was involved in one of the you may recall these operational programs on transport and so forth. And everybody produced their own plans. The railway people wanted more railways, the roads people wanted more roads, the seaport people wanted more seaports, and everybody wanted airports. There were airports proposed for Dundalk, Wexford. There was to be an airport in West Connemara, so on and so on. And one of the airports was to be in Galway. And I recall asking people to look at all these things together. Like, there are some people who do have to get from Dublin to Galway. Galway's not very big, so there's not quite as many people as you might imagine trying to get from Dublin to Galway. And they proposed to build a road to Galway, an enhanced railway to Galway, and an airport in Galway. And I said to them, you've left something out. You could build a canal to Galway as well, so people could train to Galway, they could drive to Galway, they could fly to Galway, or they could swim to Galway. And yet you have to conceptualize the problem as getting from Dublin to Galway. It's not fixing the road from Dublin to Galway or fixing the train from Dublin to Galway. It's how many people, and ditto for the minister's concern about high-speed rail from A to B. How many people actually travel each day from Cork to Donegal? I suspect it's a handful. And how do they get there? And does it matter? We don't come at things that way. The pro-cyclicality is so blatant and is again a threat that it's kind of a national scandal that it has persisted for so long. It's not funny to say that John Bruton set up a committee in 40 years ago to look at all this, which came up with the right answers 40 years ago.
On the issue of pro-cyclicality, well, I mean, isn't that the whole thrust of the main sectors of the economy? Bank lending is pro-cyclical, business investment is pro-cyclical, household consumption is pro-cyclical. It is unfortunate when the government falls into that pro-cyclical trap, because they are the one agency or the one channel in the economy that can adopt a slightly independent stance from the prevailing market trends. But obviously there's political constraints on that. There's also obviously constraints when it comes to the policies of the ECB. I mean, there's no doubt. I mean, I don't know. Well, hopefully one day a book will be written. Maybe you'll write it, Colm. But the amount of money that was spent prior to the crash on capital budgets, why is it that we had the most expensive projects in the EU? I remember at the time when he was Minister for Transport, Leo Varadkar mentioned this and said there should be some sort of investigation. Of course, there never was. But let's not forget that so much of that expenditure, and also on government consumption and social protection, huge increases. This was part of Fianna Fáil's corporatist political project. It was a political agenda, and it wasn't necessarily part of any kind of rational thinking. But by the time we hit the crash, there was no understanding within the government, and so much of the commentators in the debate in this thing, the need for counter-cyclical measures to be undertaken. In one sense, you may say, well, it was meaningless because the ECB was going to do it, allow it anyway, because we were constrained by that. Then we got the fiscal rules that copper fastened that, which was again a political construction, a compromise with German Christian democracy and the surplus countries. And of course, then what do we have in the Eurozone? We had a double recession, damn near getting into a treble dip recession. So when we come back to this, we have to accept that there are the certain sectors in the economy move in a pro-cyclical manner. We even do that, like say, even at household level. It is the government that can stand out against that. But what you need is a rational fiscal paradigm for the government to think in this way. You need public banking, which can support that, whether it's public banking through ECB or public banking here in Ireland, and also public banking that can keep the taps open as necessary to smooth out these cycles.
A chuirde plus a change plus la même chose. The IMF report November 7, 2017 in Ireland, Technical Assistance Report, Public Investment Management Assessment Report 17333 on page 40 states Irish public investment is pro-cyclical, inefficient, with an efficiency gap in infrastructure performance of 23% compared to the rest of the world and 58% compared to advanced countries, and has deficiencies such as non-publication of appraisals, cursory reviews of budgeting, lack of attention to changes in project scope and cost, non-transparent selection of project criteria, infrequent fundamental reviews, underdeveloped project monitoring, lack of cost detail for individual projects, costings which have not been validated by vote officers in DPER, and a threshold for cost benefit analysis of 20 million euros compared to 5 million in other countries on page 40. On page 47, it noted that the non-binding nature of DPER's review of appraisals is a unique feature of Ireland's system. Maybe Cork will get that yacht race after all. A chorde, buchas o chrí, támuid talki con chríche, Bowalam Mavila Buichas, Agawa Leshan Banel Elig. I would like to thank very much our speakers, Sebastian, Colm, and Michael, particularly for coming in at such short notice. I would like, of Von Machri, to thank our generous sponsors, the Dublin Chamber of Commerce, Agus Bowalam Mavila Vila Buichas, Agawa Le Machod Lakeha. I would like to thank my good friends on the committee, this year's chairperson, Yvonne McCarthy. I would like to thank Jenny, Dermot, Barra, Ronan, Ben, and Avrich. Remind you all to tune in again tomorrow. Gahena Clug, Gurmila Magi, August, Bhaird. Thank you all very, very much. See you all tomorrow.
Thank you.